with another discussion on American government. This is going to be chapter 12 on the presidency. I don't know, I think generally because of just the year and things going on, the presidency is important. But like I said, I think there's this argument that from our last chapter, chapter 11, that the Congress should be viewed as the most powerful. But there's reasons that'll probably be here why we don't, and it's debatable. So you can disagree with me. So again, trying to make these videos quick. Here we have the seal in the middle of the United States, and we have my notes here. So let's jump into it, shall we? Because the position is powerful in terms of coercion. So again, coercive power is the ability to get people to do something they otherwise wouldn't. So again, internationally with regards to the president, it's like, country A invaded country B. Well, then America can use the military from direction of the president to stop A from invading B. That's kind of basically the short story of the first Iraq War in the 90s. But so again, the president has all this coercive power. So they get that from the military and things like that. That's why it's called the executive branch, right? They execute the laws that are passed by the Congress. So they enforce them. Basically, the presidency is the enforcement branch, or part of the enforcement branch of the U.S. government. My primary concern is when the president acts unilaterally. So yeah, people generally get worried though, because even though the president is designed to act on their own, which means unilaterally or uni-one by oneself, when they commit us to actions like wars that could take lives and cost money and last decades, this is where people start to kind of have the democratic component of our liberal democratic system, where you want to have the people have a say on many of these issues, right? So again, there's always a kind of inherent tension in our system, and so in many ways the presidency is the least democratic position, which is why it's kind of controversial from time to time. This is a worry American political culture has had in many ways. A president can skirt the limitations in constitutional checks and balances. So obviously, again, with this homework, notes, there's a homework associated with it, and so this is why if you watch those videos in that homework, why kind of themes of abusive power are continuous in the American history and political tradition. Right? It's always a worry that the president's going to abuse that power because they have so much power. The role of the chief executive has changed over time, as various presidents have confronted challenges in domestic and foreign policy in times of war as well as peace, and as the power of the federal government has grown. Right. So even as basically another way of thinking about it is because the federal government has more responsibility, raises more money, the country's bigger, it's also kind of made the presidency bigger and more powerful. So we get into really good important notes to make sure you want to understand. So you really want to understand how the Electoral College works from the readings, right? So today this body comprises or consists of 538 members called electors, right? 48 states and the District of Columbia give their electoral vote to the candidate that wins the popular vote in that state, which again does not necessarily correspond to the popular vote overall. It tends to be that way, right? But not every state has an equal population, right? So President Trump in 2016 won more states, so won more electors, but that did not total more than the popular vote, right? So Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. This might smack many of you as being it is a form of democracy, but it could be more democratic, right? So more people could have more of a say. It was meant to minimize from the founders the popular vote, right? They want more popular states to kind of have a say on the culture and direction and policy of the country. So it's by design, it's on purpose. You don't have to agree with it, but if you don't, that doesn't mean the country's illegitimate or the president, whoever gets elected this next time, is illegitimate, right? That's just the way our system works. So you have to change the system to make it more legitimate, right? So it might be not illegitimate, but it could be more legitimate, right? So we can have a constitutional amendment. Maybe many of you are thinking about your papers. You can have a paper amendment to change this aspect of the Constitution, the Electoral College, to have a popular vote. So that's a potential paper topic you could talk about. Then we have anytime there's exceptions are important for notes and for exams. Nebraska and Maine are the exceptions, so they apportion out their electoral votes, right? So if candidate A gets 25% of the vote in that state, then they get 25% of the electoral votes, however many votes that would, or closest thing to it, that would be. Right? Whereas normally it's winner take all, and whoever wins a popular vote gets all of the votes. The number of electoral votes a state has is equal to the number of congressional representatives plus its 2 senators, right? And so even though D.C. is not a state, the minimum a state could have would be 3, so D.C. has 3 electoral votes. It's a city, right? The District of Columbia. The 12th Amendment coupled presidential candidates with a running mate for VP, right? So before the second place person for a time would become the vice president, and I guess maybe even after that, maybe not. It's the 12th, so it's right after. I don't know the history of that, but for much of our history, the early history, the second place winner in the electoral college would automatically become the vice president. That's how it used to work. Yeah. To win, a candidate must get a key note here: 270 electoral votes to win. The VP does not have much constitutional role. I kind of already mentioned this when we talked about the Congress. They just basically take over when the president cannot do their job, or they break a tie in the Senate. That's all. That's it. For much of our history, VPs hated their jobs. They were just bored, because these political livelihoods have been boiled down to absolutely doing nothing. And that's changed over the years. President H.W. Bush had Dick Cheney, who was very much kind of like, an advisor, like a cabinet member. And I think it's kind of been that way since. So since 2000, we've had vice presidents, maybe even Al Gore, maybe before that, maybe the mid-90s, that have been much more politically active, have helped. They don't have any actually official job, whatever responsibilities the president gives them. So for Mike Pence, President Trump was like, look, there's all this coronavirus stuff going on. We need someone who kind of carries gravitas and can organize this efforts. So you focus on that, and I'll focus on the country, right? That was probably a pretty smart thing to do. I think any president probably would have used that, right? So if this had happened during Obama's tenure, I'd imagine Joe Biden would have done the similar position, right? It's kind of a common sense executive move there to use your VP because he has nothing to do. So take care of this. Article 2 of the Constitution addresses the executive branch and its requirements, so that's kind of interesting, right? So the Constitution itself is broken up into, different sections. This whole book is not the Constitution. This is all different things. I think sometimes I pull this book out like, oh man, I'm not reading the Constitution. The Constitution really itself is not that long of a document. It's several pages, and it's kind of meant to be broad in general, so it could last a long time. President must be at least 35 years old, so I passed that barrier now. I'm getting older. Every year I make these videos, I'm getting older. You have to be a natural-born citizen, so you can't be like in the Congress, lived here for a certain amount of time. You had to be born in the United States, right? You cannot be born outside of the United States. So I think territories count, possessions count, but you can't be born in another country. Okay. Live in the United States for at least 14 years. A president, his term of office is 4 years, and you can only serve a max of two terms, right? So 8 years total, and they don't have to be in a row, right? So if I'm recording this and Trump has lost, he could run again. And if he's won, he cannot run again, if that makes sense. Not until the 22nd Amendment. So anytime we have amendments, again, you want to kind of know what they are and what they basically do. Passed in 1951 was a 2-term limit set. And this is in response, right, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which I have down here in this picture. He won 4 terms in office, right? So people, and again, there were extraordinary circumstances, so I don't think anyone thought he was illegitimate. But they're like, you know what? Let's put a cap on this. He did a good job. He pushed it. So let's just kind of make it 2. So 8 years total. And so up until World War II, no person had ever won a 3rd term in office. It is generally held by observers that this was the result of George Washington only deciding to serve 2 terms. So basically, this is why, again, political figures like President Trump are controversial for good and for bad, is because he has had a tendency to upset like traditions and norms, and many people find that abhorrent, right? But again, maybe not. Sometimes people would like maybe a 3rd term of Barack Obama. But the reason why we don't is because it was just tradition up until that point. Because no one could say they were a better president than the first president, George Washington. So he set the standard because he could have won more, right? He could have served as president until he died. He was that popular at the time, and so no other politician up until FDR really even tried to win more than 2. So because this kind of culture. So there's a culture and history to the United States, and this is one of those kind of interesting things, right? So if you're at the pictures, yeah, this is George Washington, the first president, and this is FDR, right? The book covers enumerated powers, which again, you have those enumerated, inherent, and implied powers that you should know for Congress. If you don't know those, but from 450, it talks about the enumerated or written down or expressed powers of the president, right? So the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And that's why when you're president, you cannot actually be in the military. You can have served, but you can't be an active member, right? Because America wants to avoid tyranny, coup d'etats that happen in other countries. So you have to be a civilian. That's one of the checks and balances. You're just a regular person. Um, Negotiate treaties with advice and consent from the Senate. It's one of the powers of the presidency. Receive diplomats of foreign nations, and we'll talk about that more in actually our last chapter. Broad powers to pardon those convicted of federal offenses. Call Congress into session when needed. Veto legislation. So just because legislation passes, the president can go, you know what? No, I'm going to check this. I don't like it, and then it goes back to the Congress to see if they can override a veto, which is even harder to do, right? Make policy and legislation recommendations, and nominate federal judges. And then again, it says, I have for my notes, the significant focus of presidential powers is directed at foreign affairs, international relations, right? So really what the president is really responsible for is America's interaction with the rest of the world. In many ways, you can see the president as the chief ambassador of the country. And so though they have this prominent role domestically, and they're kind of like, we'll get to this other key term in bully pulpit, to influence domestic policy. And now that we kind of expect them to do that, that's really not their job description. It's just kind of like become their job description. Right, so along with this enumerated formal powers, the presidency wields significant informal political power as well. And then again, this isn't a history class, but things like World War II, things like the Cold War have fed into this kind of way of looking at the president. So it's not just because the presidents have become more powerful. We think of them that way. And in other issues, if you take a more advanced class, Congress has basically given up some responsibility to the president because they don't want to lose an election. So they let the president do that. And that's why, for instance, the immigration issue is so contentious. Barack Obama had a policy, President Trump had a policy. They're kind of different, but in many ways similar. And that's not the job of the president at all, right? There's nothing in here that I said that says deal with immigration issues, right? That's actually Congress's responsibility. But the president can make enforcement regulations, because they are the one in charge of enforcing, that can have impacts on the outcomes of such things, like enforce the border hard, enforce the border easy, let these people in, don't let those people in, right? That's all enforcement interpretation of law. So kind of one of these kind of supporting aspects of the executive branch is the cabinet, right? So this is a key term. So what is the cabinet? Over the course of the 20th century, presidents have expanded and elaborated upon their powers. The rather vague wording in Article 2 of the Constitution, which says the executive power shall be vested in a president, has been subject to broad and sweeping interpretations in order to justify actions and beyond those specifically enumerated in the document, right? So make sure you know what the cabinet is, and this is, again, the second quotation is like why these things have become controversial, right? So these are all the other cabinet members the book talks about. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. What do those people do? The president has this thing called executive privilege. Make sure you're familiar with this. The book talks about it. The right to withhold information from Congress and the judiciary. That's kind of what this falls under. And you don't have to share with the public. This is not an enumerated power, the book tells us. The justification for this ability is that presidents need to secure candid advice from their experts and staff, right? So again, as we hear with politicians, when this stuff does come out, it's controversial. So to avoid that, you say, hey, I don't have to tell you certain things. Right? And give directions that may be controversial. Over time, presidents may utilize more unilateral power. They issue executive orders to oftentimes bypass Congress. So again, an executive order, again, like the deferred action for children, whatever it is, DACA. I can't remember. I should know that. But again, that was an executive order. And then, we get into all that kind of stuff, right? So the president kind of impacted that, President Obama. These orders essentially have the force of law, and the courts do not overturn them. This is what makes such orders. Regardless of the party of the individual holding the office, so controversial, right? Because the president's kind of using this power. It's not really clear that they have. They clearly do it all the time, so it's clearly legal. But sometimes people don't want them to use an executive order. Sometimes people want Congress to solve the problem. But oftentimes, and hopefully, I think in that Obama clip I have for you all, you hear President Obama give this kind of argument where it's like, look, the Congress didn't want to act. I had to do something because there are humanitarian reasons for my actions with regards to immigration. There are several factors that have contributed to the growth of presidential power. Socially, as a central figurehead, it is easier for the society to focus on the president, right? Especially in social media, right? Just pay attention to that word, one person said. I'm guessing many of you don't know who a congressperson from Ohio is, because we're not from Ohio. Why would we care about what they have to say? But pretty much everyone in the country, even around the world, knows who the president is at any given time, right? It's just one person you have to know. The term here is the bully pulpit, right? So it's kind of a key term. It is a key term. Make sure we know it. Additionally, Congress, depending on the political makeup, often defers to the presidential decision-making power. They pass the buck. So I talked about here. So the bully pulpit is, again, this kind of cultural megaphone that we just listen to presidents. And again, this is why President Trump, for many people, they don't like the way he uses his bully pulpit, right? So, but other people do. So it kind of washes out at the end, or did wash out at the end. What else here? So this is a picture of President Harry S. Truman. Jeopardy question. I know many of you love Jeopardy questions. He was the last president to obtain the office and not have a college degree, right? So that would have been in the late 40s and early 50s when he was president. The more things you know. And so actually it's why the expression of passing the buck or passing responsibility, he was very famous for that. He put a thing on his little thing. I don't know if you can see it. Make this a little bigger. He had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that said, "The buck stops here," meaning that he was responsible for the actions of the executive branch. And so he wasn't going to, as part of his political presentation, to tell people he was a good president. He's like, look, I'm in charge. If something bad happened, I did it. Something good happened, I also did it, right? So he was a very politically smart guy. Examples of congressional buck passing include contemporary issues of immigration. So then here's this YouTube clip I was talking about. Here's a YouTube clip for your consideration. You will notice that both President Obama and Trump treatment of the issue are actually very similar. So despite what media tells you, when you actually listen to what people have to say, it has to be the same. Because, again, America has a border, it's a country, the president is responsible for the safety of everyone and enforcing the law. So even if the president maybe even disagrees with the law, they still are bound to enforce it, right? And so, again, I think President Obama does a good job of expressing that. And, again, if you're really, I think, being fair, I think it's a view that President Trump very much had the similar view. So this is, I think, from 6 years ago. This is a result of Congress not directly addressing issues, leaving it up to the executive branch and the personal politics of the sitting president, right, to sort out the problems as they see fit. Major events and crises such as the Great Depression, 2 World Wars, the Cold War, the War on Terrorism, have further contributed to presidential stature, right? So again, I think a big one here is the Cold War. So because if we were going to face a nuclear attack through nuclear missiles from Russia, and you would need minutes to make a decision, you can't call in 535 members of the Congress, right? 100 senators, 435 Congress people, and say, let's debate what to do. Should we do 2 nukes, 1 nuke, no nukes? The president's one person, they're going to make a decision. It seems more effective. The presidential election process, it talks about, caucuses and primaries. Review this, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. Organizing to governing. So the Senate confirms or rejects the president's nominations for cabinet positions, which you have to go read that on your own, and other positions in the executive branch as well. So again, the Senate confirms is responsible for this because the president's job more or less is the responsibility of the nation. You want the equal representation, even regardless of population, to kind of make these decisions for everyone, right? Because we're all affected equally, even if we live in a state that has 500,000 people versus a state with 40 million people. Here's an important key term: the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. This organization is important as it develops and oversees the president's budget proposals. It oversees the executive branch's budgetary implementation during the federal fiscal year. So again, key terms here to know on your own: recess appointments, and again, First Lady stuff, a direct presidential action. So again, I'm not really going to ask you questions about the First Lady. Hopefully soon we'll have a first man or whatever, first dude. Direct presidential actions, national security stuff. So you guys can look at the history of that. And I'll have actually a video about Woodrow Wilson and his wife, who kind of was president. If you don't know the history, it's kind of funny that I'll probably post on the canvas for that. So hopefully you did the homework. We're starting to get to the end. These are some of the more important chapters, the ones that people kind of already know about and things like that. Again, I'm trying to keep it short and sweet. So read, ask questions, read, and I will see you guys in the next video.